as all of us, as scientists here and people who care about science, understand, data is what we need. We have lots of passion, we have lots of interests, but really what we need is data. And I have been following the work of Catalyst for years. Anna Beninger, our next speaker, who's the research director there, has reminded me that this is no longer a new organization. It's how many years old?
56.
56, goodness. It was started when this issue was much smaller, but a focus on data. And so Anna hasn't been doing it there for 56 years, obviously, but her role in working with over 800 corporate members worldwide is a hugely important piece for us. As I said, it's the data piece that's really important for us. The other is connecting it to what Rita was just saying worldwide, and the corporate side. Most of us in this room are connected with universities, with nonprofits. The role of corporations worldwide is essential. Like in the world of universities and research, there have been fits and starts. We've had great progress, and Anna will touch on some of that. Unfortunately, this is a year of some backsliding. So although we had Rudolph's presentation before lunch, which was so energizing for all of us, it sounds like the world is fixed, we're good. Women are on the rise. Not completely. So I hope Anna will give us both some good news and some bad news, but really appreciate her ability to come and share the corporate world with us and data. Thanks, Anna.
And I'm just really, really excited to be here with all of you. And a big part of that really is because I'm providing a slightly different lens. So as she mentioned, I'm providing that corporate perspective. We come at it from working with over 800 supporter organizations. They're almost all for-profit, though we do have some universities and nonprofits and governmental organizations that are part of Catalyst. But I'm excited to have an engaging conversation with you today about disrupting the default for women in STEM. And just a little bit more about Catalyst and our history. We were founded back in 1962 by a woman named Felice Schwartz. And the primary goal of the organization back then really was about getting women into the labor force and giving them the skills and the experience that they need. The thinking at the time was that if we just get them the education, we get them some training, we get them into the labor force in large numbers, everything else will take care of itself. By the mid and early 1980s, we found that that was simply not the case. And so Catalyst's perspective at that point really shifted away from individual women and much more so towards organizations. Because, as Rita mentioned, it's the systems that are broken. There's nothing wrong with the women. It became very clear by then that women were in the labor force in large numbers, and yet we're hitting barrier after barrier after barrier. And so how is it that we address that? And that's where our model changes. That's where we really began working with large corporations and tried to break down those barriers from the inside out. We work to accelerate progress for women through workplace inclusion. Today, you'll hear me talk a lot about diversity, but inclusion also is incredibly important. We'll talk a little bit about that as well. And I am in the research department. Our founding was in research, has always been in research, so you'll see quite a bit of that as well. And we do that by then having consulting and tools and workshops and a whole wide range of other ways to apply that research on the ground in organizations. The goal to see meaningful, tangible progress today. So first, we'll establish the problem. This is just the same data provided in a different picture that we've seen the last couple of days. So this pyramid is specifically women in S&P 500 companies. And you'll see that women are almost half the labor force, and yet there are simply 24 women. That's 4.8% women CEOs. And notably, this is S&P. If we look at Fortune, we hit a peak. Actually, Joanne mentioned this yesterday of 32 women last year, which has now slipped down this year. Slightly different pools of organizations, but same problem. Here, just because of our crowd, exact same shape that you see for women in academia. Overwhelmingly, women are concentrated in this lower level, lower paid, less prestigious, non-tenure tracked instructor level positions. And as you move up, women are significantly less likely to become tenured and to become full professors. And I should note that this trend, this pyramid that we talk about, is universal. It does not matter whether you talk about government, nonprofits, corporations, academia. It does not matter if you're talking about the developed world or underdeveloped worlds, you're talking about the US or India or China or Japan. It really does not matter. This is the same. And if we see equal representation, what we're looking for is that square or that rectangle. And notably, change has been painfully slow. So here in the US, in the last almost decade, the proportion of women in leadership has grown by barely a percentage point. Barely a percentage point. Extraordinarily painful. So again, this then raises the question, obviously speaking to the choir a little bit here, why should we care? But more importantly, and I think more strategically, why should leaders care? We talked yesterday about how critical leaders are to driving change. Without their buy-in, you've got nothing. Truly, nothing sustainable, nothing meaningful. So why should leaders care? Leaders in government, leaders in corporations, leaders in academia, why should they care? Well, this tries to take lots and lots and lots of studies and distill them into sort of one slide. But the bottom line is that everybody benefits from diversity. Everybody does. And part of the challenge, and we'll get into this a little bit more later, is that there's a real fear among those who are currently in power that they're going to lose power if you improve the diversity within organizations. But that is just simply not true, and the data does not bear that out. So there are many studies behind every single one of these individual points. I do want to note, though, just to be honest, that when you hear about the business case for diversity, people have brought into question the financial performance piece. And it is impossible to actually draw a causal connection between diversity and the financial performance of an organization. You can't do it. Or women on boards, you just can't do it. There are too many variables at play. But if you look at it from a correlational standpoint, and you also look at many other outcome variables, it is undeniable that there are really positive benefits from this. And just sort of to help remove from this beautiful graph for a second, and just envision for yourself that you're sitting around a table. You're in your workplace, does not matter where you are. You're in the lab, you're in a corporate setting, you're in government talking policy, talking about patents maybe. You're sitting around the table, and you look around, and everyone pretty much looks like you. Likely, because of simply what you look like, regardless of perhaps the other circumstances of how you grew up, people treated you similarly. You came to view challenges or the world in a similar way. You saw certain outcomes when you would say something or do something, and certain things would happen. There's a real similarity simply because of what you look like. And as a result, when you talk about being in a workplace, someone comes up with an idea. All of a sudden, everybody else, oh, that's great, yeah, that's good, okay. And you fall into groupthink. This problem of just reinforcing one another's ideas, and then you just run with it. The problem with that is that you miss tremendous opportunity to poke holes in that, to perhaps find if there's a better way of doing it, to question assumptions that have been made. So instead, picture that same table, and you have a bunch of people who look different from each other. They've likely grown up in different ways, and more importantly, had people treat them differently. They've had different experiences. A lot of this comes back to some of those stereotypes, which we'll get to in a minute, and Joanne talked a lot about yesterday. You view the world differently. You view problems differently. You've had different life experiences. So you are much more likely, when someone throws an idea, to perhaps have a different viewpoint, or maybe you see a potential challenge with that. So it creates this really robust, collaborative effort of challenging one another's thinking. And you ultimately develop better decisions, you're more innovative, and the outcomes are more positive for organizations and for teams, importantly, than when you have homogeneous groups. Now notably, and this is where the inclusion piece comes in, if you have a diverse team, but people do not feel safe speaking up, if they don't feel safe challenging one another, if you don't have that psychological safety there, and you don't have the inclusion, then you kind of have a recipe for disaster. So you can't simply just throw a bunch of diverse people around. They have to also feel included. So that's sort of where the inclusion of D&I, diversity and inclusion, comes into play. So anyway, just to establish, everybody benefits. I know everybody in here probably agrees with that, but it's worth just mentioning this. Okay, so also just for the sake of it, a couple of examples of what happens when you don't have diversity. So you perhaps have that really homogeneous team sitting around the table from each other. In the upper left-hand corner, this is an old example. So when early car airbags were developed, they only used adult male crash test dummies. So when those airbags were placed into cars and they exploded, women and children became very severely harmed, and some died because they were not tested and they were not meant for those smaller bodies. Really severe outcomes there. On the right-hand side, there's an actual video of this one. Didn't want to deal with the technology here, but let me know and I can send it to you. This is an automatic soap dispenser, much like the one in the bathrooms here, if you stick your hand underneath it. If you take a white hand, put your light skin hand, underneath, no problem. Doop, dispenses soap. You put a dark skin hand, no soap. No soap. So you literally see him take a piece of the white paper towel, fold it up, stick it underneath the thing, zoop, there goes your soap. All-white development team of this automatic soap dispenser meant that it could not read dark-skinned hands. This one here, I'm speaking really about artificial intelligence here and machine learning. We know, for example, with early voice recognition systems, we found that they were programmed by men who have deeper voices. So when women tried to use them, it wouldn't recognize women's voices. And a more current example deals with facial recognition software, which has become more and more ubiquitous. We see it in the smartphones all over the place, and it's being used in all kinds of security camera footage and all types of functions, and it's probably just going to continue to explode. It is excellent at recognizing white male faces. Excellent. Decent at white female faces. Horrible at people of color's faces, in particular women of color's faces. And in fact, there's a study, and there was a good article from an African-American woman engineer at MIT who's working in this, and it fails to recognize her face. So she literally takes like a Halloween mask, a white mask, to put it over her face, and then automatically recognizes a face. It's mortifying. And honestly, why we should care so much about artificial intelligence is because, as we all know, it's going to play an outsized role in our lives. I mean, it's already beginning to happen, but that's just going to accelerate. It is going to change our lives in ways that we can not even possibly imagine right now. And one little example, when we talk about what happens with bias that gets embedded into that technology, some of you may have seen a week or two ago, there was an article about Amazon that came out about their hiring practices. They tried to use artificial intelligence to screen resumes. And they thought, this is great, we're going to root out all these problems, take out human error, human bias. Turns out, it was so painfully biased that any woman was completely eliminated from the process, because they took 10 years of their existing resumes of existing staff who were almost all white men and fed it into the system, and that's essentially programmed to only look then for white men. So they ultimately discontinued that, but they used it for years. Think about the damage that was done with that. So consider the data, the people, the framework of people who are creating this technology and how it's going to impact every single one of us in ways that we don't yet understand. So this is part of why this matters so much. And of course, actually, it was mentioned yesterday, but when you think about science and medicine and development of drugs, think about the challenges and the problems of not using women when you're developing new medicines and you're testing products. I mean, again, what happens? Think about this particular example of the airbag, but dosages and human body, the example from yesterday around understanding heart attacks in men and what that then means for women. Women are grossly underdiagnosed with things, just again, because it goes back to expectations and norms. So we have to think about this from the framework of what happens when you don't have those diverse people representing diverse viewpoints around the table. So again, emphasizing why STEM matters. Well, in this particular study we see from the US labor force from 2014 to 2024, we're going to see a 150% increase in STEM over non-STEM industries. And honestly, right now, they already have a significant labor shortage. It's a problem. But this is where the real growth is and truly where the impact is going to have on all of us. So this is why we really need to care about STEM industries specifically. And again, here we see the labor force participation in the US, we're at about half. And for the last 20 to 25 years, 30 years, it's been pretty steady. But if you look at women in STEM, it's plateaued at about a quarter. And actually, we saw a tiny dip in 2015. They don't have current numbers out yet. And I do want to make just a quick note about this. Some of you may have seen that there are efforts being done by IBM, by Goldman Sachs, by a variety of different other nonprofits around returnship programs. So the idea of the talent that you might lose that are educated, particularly with women if they've left to care for children, to bring them back to the labor force. And these are really fantastic efforts. They're working from a variety of different angles in a variety of different industries, mostly male-dominated industries. But the challenge at this point is it's really only been a couple of years, and the percentage of women they've impacted is just a handful. So we're really looking forward to see what's going to happen in the long term. But right now, for example, IBM has had less than 100 women participate in their program. And IBM has 400,000 employees, so just to give you a sense. It's fantastic efforts. We really want to support it. But that's not going to fix the problem if we think about this gap here. So what's behind all of this? Well, I think one thing, and particularly relevant in this setting, is that we often hear what we call the education excuse. Where are the women? They say, well, companies say we can't hire them because they're not getting the degrees necessary. Now, without a question, we need more women getting the degrees. We absolutely do. But if you set that aside for a second and just look at the experiences of women who are educated and are working in these industries, what's it like for them? What happens, let's say they get that degree, what happens to them? Well, we did a whole study. This study comes from a longitudinal study, 10 years, that we've been following the careers of about 10,000 high potential employees. Women and men, these we used MBA graduates as a proxy for high potentials here. And effectively, we've tracked them. So you've got about 2/3 men, 1/3 women. That's about the proportion of women and men graduating from MBA programs. US, Canada, Europe, Asia. Really incredible sample we've been following. So we took this group, and we said, OK, we know that a lot of the issues in STEM around women and technical talent have been very clearly identified. But what about the other women in the organization? The women that are working on the business side of the house. There are a huge proportion of roles in marketing, finance, HR, sales that are critical to these companies to be able to run. What's it like for them? Because is this really a technical talent problem, or is this an industry problem? OK, so we took these MBA grads, and we wanted to see what happened to them. Interestingly, despite many of them taking non-technical roles upon graduating from their MBA, a huge proportion of them had STEM pedigrees in one form or another. So they either had undergrad degrees in the STEM field, or they had some career experience before getting their MBA in that space. But looking at those that then take a job in a non-technical role upon graduation, what we found was that overwhelmingly, women were significantly less likely to opt for those jobs in STEM fields. And of those that did, they were significantly more likely to leave after that very first job for a job in another industry and never come back. So these are not women leaving the labor force. They're leaving to work in other industries, non-STEM industries. And this is critical because this is talent that can literally work anywhere. If you're in sales, you can be sales in a tech company, or you can be sales in a consumer products company. So looking at that then, what we found was that women doing these roles, so say take a woman in sales, doing the exact same job in a tech company versus a consumer products company, the woman in the tech company had significantly more barriers than the woman doing the exact same job in a non-STEM industry. Fascinating. So again, this is not a technical talent issue. This is a cultural problem in these industries. And what we see that is that these women who are opting either not to ever go work there, perhaps maybe they had an internship in the industry while they were in school and then opted not to go work there, or of those that do decide to work there and then they leave and never come back, this is a cultural problem. So simply fixing the educational pipeline is not going to fix this. Because let's say you educate them all, but then they're going to go take their skills elsewhere. So as we peel back the layers a little bit, when we talk about of the women that do work there, why are they leaving? Why are they going to take their skills to a different industry? A big piece of it deals with isolation. We saw that here. Feeling like an outsider, being the only woman in the room, is such a common expression. It's just painful. And that actually has very significant outcomes. We tested this. We measured this. So we did an entire study on what it's like to be an outsider, to feel like another. So this was a self-report study where people literally, in a matrix, were asked, to what extent do you feel like an outsider on this scale, according to various dimensions of your identity? So if you cut by gender, cut by race, ethnicity, cut by parental status, right? So you're looking, self-report, I'm stating that I feel like an outsider. Turns out, if you report feeling like an outsider, you are significantly less likely to get access to critical development opportunities. You're less likely to access to senior level leaders. You're more likely to downsize your career aspirations. So there are really significant career penalties for personally feeling like an outsider. It does not matter what other people think of you. It's how do you feel, which is quite fascinating. So that's a big impact here because women are, in fact, really isolated. Lack of effective sponsors, and I specifically say sponsor here, not mentor, and we'll get into the difference between the two in a little bit, but that's an important point. But here, just very briefly, a sponsor is a senior level leader in your organization, in your department, who can put your name forward for critical opportunities, who can tap you for assignments, who can obviously vouch for you for promotions, that they're a real champion for you. It's different from mentoring in that way, and we'll talk a little bit more in detail, but women are significantly less likely to get that in these organizations. The hostile male-dominated work environments, overt harassment, overt sexism, overt bias is painfully common in ways that in other industries, even shockingly, you take finance. Finance is doing a lot better than tech companies, than STEM companies is. They were grappling with this overt bias 20 years ago, and they've made some headway. The unconscious bias is everywhere, and that's harder to fight. But the overt acts, the hostile acts, a lot of the painful, sexual harassment we've been talking about, it's more prevalent in these industries than it is in other industries. I mean, the stories abound of, a tech company hosting a party, and for diversity they hire female cocktail waitresses to provide diversity to parties. I mean, that happened 2 years ago. 2 years ago, and may still be happening, but that's one example. So it's a very serious problem. And this last piece, ineffective feedback and unclear evaluation criteria. It's a little bit more in the weeds, but I highlight this for several reasons. Overwhelmingly, women do not get the feedback that they need. Doesn't matter the industry, but we find that it's even worse in STEM industries. So what I mean by that is women are significantly more likely to get vague feedback, even if it's good or bad. Oh, you're doing a great job. Great job with what, how? Or, I don't really see the leadership skills I need from you, or I don't really see this, so come back to me next year, we'll talk then. What does that even mean? Vague, unspecific feedback, and the feedback women get are also significantly more likely to focus on communication style and not on something related to the job itself, the work, anything. You're too bossy. You don't speak up enough. You're too aggressive. Anything that could be related to this tightrope that women have to walk when it comes to being seen as someone with leadership capability. And also the unclear evaluation criteria. How do you know how you're going to be evaluated if it's not specific? And if they say you're not ready or you're not up for opportunities, why? How do you fight back? How do you argue against that? So this is not even covering all the bases. These are just some of the high-level issues. There is no silver bullet that's going to fix all of this. But there are some very specific things to address the structural and cultural problems in organizations to help begin to level the playing field. So I want to break it down into the three main categories around recruitment, development, and retention. So from a recruitment standpoint, the recruitment process turns out to be extraordinarily riddled with bias. Every single step of the recruitment process is riddled with bias. And we'll talk just a little bit about that. I want to delve specifically into the job description piece today because it's a small thing, but it can really make a powerful difference. With development, here's where we want to disrupt that idea that women simply need to be mentored, and instead we need to shift that focus to sponsorship. And for that last piece, we need to get away from this idea that diversity is a women's issue. Instead, we need to engage men. We need to get men to be a part of the solution. All right, so let's start with recruitment. We talked a lot about this in the last couple of days, but just very briefly, there's something called the think leader, think male mindset. We talk about it as, men as default leaders. Essentially, anybody, and if I've done this exercise countless times, you have them close their eyes, anybody in the room, everybody, envision a leader, and you say, get volunteers. Pretty much everyone references a man, women and men alike. When you close your eyes, you envision a leader, you picture a man. And it's not surprising, because who of all of the presidents been in this country? Who are the people who are held up in basically every industry that we have? Who's leading 95% of corporations? It's not surprising that we envision leaders as men. But what that means is that leadership has become synonymous with masculine characteristics. This idea that men are born leaders, right? That's the idea. And women are starting out from behind, from the get-go. Now, this study, actually, Joanne mentioned yesterday, I'll just very briefly mention it for those of you who weren't here for that. This has been replicated countless times, but this is where you take the exact same resume, you put Jennifer Smith or John Smith at the top, and you ask who would you hire and how much would you pay them. And across the board, everybody, women and men alike, are more likely to hire John and to offer him a lot more money than Jennifer. The exact same resume. The exact same resume. And fascinatingly, the CEO of Corning, this is a very interesting story, he wanted to hire more women in his organization. This happened a couple of years ago. So he had his executive team, mostly male. He has a couple of women around the table. And he goes in, he has a bunch of resumes, specifically women's resumes. He asks the recruiter for women's resumes. And they're just constantly poking holes in them. She's not ready for this, that reason, excuse after excuse after excuse. Okay, he goes away, comes back, has another set of resumes, evaluating them, same problem, they're poking holes, poking holes. He says, you know what? These are all of your resumes. He literally passed out these people's resumes, masked the names, and said, so you're saying I shouldn't have hired any of you, right? So the bias in this is shocking. And we have to understand that given that is the case, we are not going to stop people from being biased. We can make people aware of their bias, although if you simply do that, you make it worse. Instead, you need to give them specific actions and steps they can use to change their behavior. Earlier we heard, you can't change people, but you can change behavior, and that's what we need to do. One more point here about getting credit, thinking about hiring, thinking about recruitment. Overwhelmingly, and this was mentioned earlier too, when there's any vague mention of who's done what in a project team, or if it's just the team accomplished X, people are going to attribute that to men, if it's not very clearly delineated who accomplished what. And again, women and men alike make those attribution errors. Now this study I love because it points to this issue. This actually comes from a study that's specifically focused on economists. So with economic papers, I learned this through the study, authors are not listed in the order in which they made contributions. They're ordered alphabetically. So as a result, you have to make assumptions, or tenure reviewers make assumptions about who contributed what to those various papers. So what this study showed was that when women collaborate, they are given much less credit for the work. It's assumed that they didn't contribute. Whereas when men collaborate, there's no penalty. So the only way to really try and close the gap, at least in economics, is for women to sole author papers. So there's no confusion about who did what. And this, again, comes back to how you attribute credit to people. And again, you're just assuming women didn't do it. They couldn't have. Why would they? No one would say this out loud, but that's the underlying bias that we have. So when we come back specifically to the recruitment process, actually there are even smaller steps in between here, but if we look at the entire process, there is bias baked in at every point. If we're talking systems here, this is a system. Literally from the point at which you're conceptualizing the job itself, and then you write the job description, bias gets baked in, and I'll show you some examples of that. Then when you're attracting candidates, who are you attracting? From where? What kind of experience? Do you have a really specific mindset about who could do that job? Probably because of who's already done it in the past. The hiring committee, so who's doing the hiring and making decisions. The interview process in particular, that is a really biased process. But there are some very specific things that you can do to really mitigate the impact of bias on the decisions that are happening. Then, of course, how you make the offer, and obviously tracking progress throughout that whole time. I've done entire talks just on this. We're only going to take a moment and talk a little bit about the job description piece here, because it's one piece. If you want to talk more detail, happy to chat about any other steps. So when you're talking about job descriptions, overwhelmingly, they are riddled with masculine terminology. So on the left-hand side here, you'll see words that are stereotypically masculine. Boasting, challenging, competitive, determined, superior, self-confident. These are stereotypically masculine terms. And job descriptions are overwhelmingly riddled with them, not intentionally by any stretch. And it could literally pop up in the description of the company, and obviously then in the requirements of the job itself. In every little piece, you'll see words like this pop up. But these more stereotypically feminine adjectives are much, much less common. Things that highlight like cooperative, trust, supportive, honest, interpersonal. Despite the fact that all the research shows these characteristics are really important to being an effective leader, It's just not what people associate with leadership. It's not what people associate, honestly, with competence. That's what's going into when you're talking about hiring. So as a result, there's a lot that you can do to help in the recruitment process by simply minimizing the impact of these masculine terminology, making it more gender balanced, because gender neutral is virtually impossible. You're not going to eliminate all of these words, but making it more balanced such that you're not turning women off from even applying. Because what turns out is that you have a job description, right? And you're explaining what you can do, who they're looking for, all these requirements. Women will not even apply for the job because they cannot see themselves being successful there. Essentially, what they're describing is a man. And so they literally, unconsciously read the job description, see it riddled with these masculine terms, turns them off from even applying. So we've done a lot of exercises, and we've done extensive research with many of our corporate clients where we've audited their job descriptions. So we take a job description, identify the problematic terminology, change the language. All of a sudden, they get many more women applicants. You're not changing the job. You're not changing what it takes to be successful. You're just changing how you're describing it. And this comes back to what can be expected. Now, I will also say that there are other important aspects beyond the words itself with job descriptions. For example, having required characteristics be a shorter list and then desired being a slightly longer list points back to research. Women are more likely to feel like they need to check every single box before they'll apply, whereas men may check half before they'll apply. So you can minimize that as well by saying, well, these 4 or 5 things are really critical. And then all these other things, that would be great, but not totally necessary. We can train you, we can teach you any of those other things. That also helps. But back to the terminology piece. So here's a really short exercise. Okay, here's a job description. We are a top engineering firm that's dominant in the marketplace, boasting many leading clients. We're determined to lead the industry. Our success stems from consistently challenging our competition. The essential functions are to challenge the status quo by creating superior product designs through the development and testing of specifications and methods. So if I hadn't explained all of that to you beforehand, maybe some of these words, maybe, but for the most part, it probably would have sounded decent, right? Not too problematic. So here are the 7 words in this tiny little description. Dominant, boasting, determined, lead, challenging, challenge, superior. And none of the feminine, stereotypically feminine words. So here's an example of how you can change it to say the exact same thing, but without the problematic terms. We're a top engineering firm that's highly regarded in the marketplace, servicing many leading clients. We're rewarded by our rates of client satisfaction and industry reputation. Our success stems from our long-term client relationships. The essential function is to inspire your team to create innovative product designs, the development and testing of specifications and methods. You're saying the same thing. You're saying the same thing, but in a much more gender-balanced, accessible way. So I just make this point because what's so striking is that job descriptions, when you think about recruitment, are a small thing, and yet it can really have a powerful impact. Now, job descriptions alone are not going to fix the problem. They're not going to dramatically increase all of your talent and all of your roles. But it's something that most companies, most academic institutions, most individual managers have the ability to fix. And notably, there's interesting software, and people have led startups. One is called Tightrope, that are helping companies to systematize this, to actually scan job descriptions for problematic terms and help to create, again, with companies have thousands or tens of thousands of job openings to be able to do that. So that's the piece around recruitment. Now, let's talk a little bit about development. Development is so fundamentally important for people's careers. You know, once you get in there, great, but what happens to you then? We saw 47% of the labor force is made up of women, but what happens to them once they're in the labor force? This is where this important distinction between mentoring and sponsorship comes into play. Now, mentoring certainly is extremely important. We've heard some really good examples earlier today. I would say like the media being one example. I would say, you know, understanding how a company works or an academic institution works, who you should know who does what. There are a lot of really important roles that mentors play. Yet notably, mentoring does not predict advancement. Sponsorship predicts advancement. So a mentor, they're going to have a cup of coffee with you. They're going to provide you with advice and guidance. They're interested not only in your professional life, but if you have questions or concerns about how to meld that with your personal life, For example, your female mentor may give you guidance about, from an academic life, to when's best to have children, when's it going to have the least impact on my career. Mentors can give you all kinds of really helpful advice based off of their own career experiences and what they have learned from others over the course of their lives. And yet, women have been mentored to death. In our study of high potentials, we found that women actually had more mentors on average than men did, and yet it didn't do anything for career advancement. It's the sponsorship piece. So a sponsor is someone, as I mentioned earlier, who's typically in your current organization, in your academic institution. There's someone there in a position of power. They're ideally highly placed. They sit at the key decision-making table, and they can put your name forward for critical development opportunities, for co-authoring papers, for international assignments, for promotions, for whatever it is that can help get you ahead in your career. Notably, the gender does not matter, just the level. So the more senior a person is, the better position they're in to provide this kind of support. So I love this. Mentors will talk with you. Sponsors will talk about you. The very interesting thing about sponsors, you can have sponsors and not even know it. Sponsors can be behind the scenes and advocating for you. You may not even know what's happening. But sponsors are so powerful. And notably, men are the ones that are significantly more likely to have access to those senior level sponsors. And that necessarily shouldn't surprise us, because when we think back to the pyramid from the beginning, who's at the top of organizations? Virtually all men. Positions of power and authority. Psychological being what it is, people are attracted to people like themselves. So men are much more likely to reach down to junior level men who they can relate to, who look like them, who remind them of themselves, and to pay it forward to them. And they're much less likely to reach to people who they don't look like, who they can have a harder time connecting with. And that informal sponsorship, honestly, is the vast majority of sponsorship that happens. Corporations can put formal sponsorship programs into place, and they can be very effective. But those are definitely the minority when you think about sponsorship relationships. Now, I do want to make a plug here, because you may think, well, I've just spent all this time talking about the value to the individual being sponsored. But what's in it for the person doing the sponsorship? Think about it. There's a potential risk for them because they put their credibility on the line for someone. They're leveraging their reputation for someone. So what's in it for them? Well, it turns out that paying it forward pays back, literally. So people who were developing other talent, who were more likely to invest in that talent, were actually advancing faster and earning more money themselves than people who were not developing other talent. And we actually, so controlling for all other variables, what we found in this particular study across a 2-year time window, people developing other talent earned over $25,000 more than those not. And the primary reason for that is it's really good for organizations. When a senior level leader is investing in up-and-coming talent, that's succession planning, that's retention, that's engagement, that's development, there's a lot of really positive things for the company. And it's a relatively simple and straightforward thing for a senior leader to do. So it's a very positive, mutually beneficial relationship. And it's something that really pays off for everyone involved. Now, I do want to take a moment to address this idea of the queen bee, because I think many of us, probably all of us, have heard stories of a senior level woman who did not pay it forward, and in fact may have sort of personified this idea that, well, I had to fight my way to the top, so you should too. I'm not going to help you. So this idea of the queen bee is quite pervasive. But the reality is that you cannot take a simple case study, one example, one anecdote of perhaps one woman that you know of or have heard of from here, from her, and apply it to half the population. So we tested this in our study, and what we found was that overwhelmingly, women are more likely to be investing in up-and-coming talent than men are, and also more likely to investing in other women. So even, especially this last point here, when you're looking at people who are working really long hours, women are still significantly more likely to be paying it forward. So my hope is that we can put the queen bee to rest, recognize it's a myth, and not really give it any more energy, because in fact it is true, and women really are supporting other women to a great extent. But of course we know that that's not going to be enough to move the needle. We need men to actively champion and engage women as well. It benefits everybody. And honestly, the slide here about how it benefits everybody is a great way to get men interested in this. But it's such a positive, mutually beneficial thing for everyone involved. But the only way we're really going to move the needle is if those men who occupy the vast majority of those senior level positions that are in positions of power and authority, that have the ability to change someone's career in one move, one phone call, we need them to begin to think outside themselves, to be more intentional about how they're developing talent, and to look beyond the usual suspects, the people that they feel most comfortable with, and perhaps maybe those informal circumstances of going to the bar after work, or in some industries, the strip clubs, as unfortunate as that is. Pick your golf courses, pick your setting. Those types of things are when all of the sponsorship tends to happen. They'll tap somebody for an opportunity, it will have come and gone, and you will have never even known it was there. And so that's where we need this intentional, strategic thought on the part of senior level leaders, those men in particular, to be engaged if we're really going to see us move the needle. And the other thing that I love about this sponsorship piece is that you avoid this idea of tokenism. Because this is not about just promoting women because we're going to have half women and we just have to say we have half. This is about giving women opportunities to show what they are capable of. It's simply opening the door. Open the door to doors that have been slammed and closed to women for a very long time. It's just opening the door, giving them a chance. And that's why I think this is so powerful. So that brings me to my final piece around retention and culture and the critical importance of engaging men. Women have been talking to other women about these issues for decades. And look at how little progress we have made. There has absolutely been progress, but we have such a long ways to still go. And the only way we're really going to make seismic jumps is to get men actively involved. And yet, privilege is invisible to those who have it. Most men have no idea what it's like to be anything other than a man. Rightly so. That's their own lived experience. But as a result, it's very hard for them to wrap their heads around the problems that women run up against. It's hard for them to even understand what they are and let alone acknowledge that they're there. Because if it's not in front of them and it's not part of their lived experience, why would they? And yet, what we see here is that millennials are not going to be the solution. If you look across the board, across generations, less than half of men think that gender stereotyping is a barrier to women's advancement compared to 76% of women. The gap is worse with millennials. 90% of millennial women feel gender discrimination is an issue in workplaces today compared to 57% of millennial men. This study was done 2 years ago, 2016. Millennials are not going to be the silver bullet, our saviors. It's not going to happen. So we have to work and be more strategic and engage everyone in the labor force. This is not just about resting our hopes on one generation of people. So that awareness piece is massive. So how are we otherwise going to do this? I think the first thing is to invite men in. Because anytime we say the word diversity or gender or inclusion or anything that may feel like this realm over here, men feel like they're not part of it. They haven't been in the past, so why would they now? And they also may feel vilified. They may feel as if, I don't want to touch that because I might say the wrong thing. I might come across as sexist, or I have no opinion on this, or I have no experience. I have no idea. And so we see, especially when we're working with corporations, that there are a whole wide range of ways to address these issues. A lot of companies, for example, have ERGs, or various women's groups that you may have heard of. We call them employee resource groups or business resource groups. But there are plenty of examples, too, in academia and in government. And those are amazing because they provide an outlet for women. They provide a support network, which is necessary given all of the barriers that women deal with. But we cannot exclude men from the conversation. So there have to be ways, and companies do that with diversity councils or with panels, or we heard just yesterday examples at Brown of how they go about doing that. So men have to feel like they're a part of the conversation and that they're not to blame for this. So that's the first big piece. I mentioned the awareness because that's a big one, because if they don't think there's a problem, then what are you trying to fix? This third point is really critical, discouraging zero-sum thinking. So I mentioned at the outset that men have a lot of fear. There's a lot of fear that if you are supporting talent that look different from you up in the pipeline, if you're actively championing diversity, I'm going to lose out. It's a fixed sum or fixed pie, zero-sum game. So I'm not going to get involved in that. Why do I want to give up power? The reality is, and as we showed at the beginning, everyone benefits when you improve diversity and inclusion in organizations. Everyone. You get more opportunities, you get better decisions, you improve financial performance in organizations, all these really positive outcomes. You get more business, there's more work for everybody, more opportunities. But we have to help men to see that because the fear can be paralyzing. That is the #1 reason that men don't get involved in these efforts, because they're afraid of losing their own positions of privilege that they have benefited from. This fourth one around providing men with women mentors is another really interesting strategy. This has been shown actually with a variety of different stereotypes and biases that people can hold. So we all know, and we saw from Joanne with the implicit association test yesterday, we all hold these biases, which of course feel very nebulous to us. We're not conscious of them the vast majority of the time. But when you're confronted with a real live human being in person, you can see right in front of you, you can talk to, you can engage with, who violate those stereotypes that you might have. So the think leader, think male mindset, for example. You have a junior level man, you give him a female mentor. All of a sudden, all of these biases that he has about women not being good leaders, women not being successful in industry X, role Y, all of a sudden that's really uncomfortable for him because he's got this cognitive dissonance at play. Here's a very successful woman in my industry. Funny thing about that. And so, honestly, a single case really minimizes the impact of their stereotypes on their decision-making and on their behavior. This has been done very successfully also across racial and ethnic lines. When you have people who are really biased or very racist, and they meet somebody of the race that they're against, it really minimizes because they're a human being. They're no longer just this concept. It's fascinating when you see that, and it's such a powerful technique because it just takes one. Have them engage with one person. Obviously, many more examples is good, but it makes them question all of those stereotypes and makes them more aware of the problems, back to the awareness piece. So there are really positive outcomes to this. I will say that it's an interesting strategy, and not a lot of companies have picked up on it because with the very few women mentors that are seniors in organizations, they're like, why am I going to mentor a man? I want to mentor the women coming up behind me, which is great. But again, it is, from a research standpoint, an effective strategy. And the last piece around promoting inclusive leadership. So I mentioned at the outset about the importance of inclusion. I've done whole day workshops just on inclusion, so that's a different conversation for a different day. But I do want to mention it here because a very interesting strategy engaging men is not using the word diversity, but instead talking about inclusion or inclusive leadership. Because all of a sudden, instead of it being a discussion about diversity equals women, it's about everybody. Inclusion is everybody. I'm a part of that. Plus, you throw the word leadership after anything and they show up. It is fascinating. When you look at organizations, they put on events, you talk about inclusive leadership, men show up. We have an amazing Catalyst X course on inclusive leadership. More than half of the people who have participated are men. More than half. Of tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people. So it's globally, too, fascinating. So this inclusive leadership piece is another really great way to get men involved. And notably, as I said, you need to increase the representation, but what are you going to do once they're there? They have to feel included, which essentially is this idea that not only do you feel like you belong, but you also are valued for the unique perspectives that you bring to the table. You don't want just the belongingness because people ultimately assimilate, and you lose all of the beauty of that diversity. You need people to feel like they can bring their full selves to the table. So that inclusion is a really fundamental piece, and that's just opening the door a little bit to a whole topic area. So my final piece is that there are a lot of ways to get men as a part of the conversation. We have this really interesting platform called MARC, which stands for Men Advocating for Real Change. This is just it's free, it's an online community, it's a place for men to be able to go to essentially ask the questions they might otherwise be afraid to ask, to learn. There's a lot of great resources, there are webinars, there are opportunities for them. Women are certainly welcome as well, but it's really meant as a platform for men. We also do a ton of other work, like in-person workshops and all these other consulting sessions and things with organizations, but as a virtual platform that have men participating from all over the world, It's a really great way to improve that awareness piece that we talked about at the outset. And notably, one of the pieces that we'll see often, and this was actually mentioned in the opening talk, was around working fathers and those that want to take a break or those that fear bias. Talking about gender bias here, and here it applies to men as well. So you get some really interesting dialogue, really interesting and engaging sessions to see how men are beginning to conceptualize these issues and how they touch their everyday lives. And importantly, if we can crack this code, how they themselves will personally benefit, not only professionally, but in their personal lives as well. So any questions? I don't know if I have any time left for any questions. Yes, please.
I have 2 questions.
Yes.
I'm trying to choose between them in case there's not enough.
Okay.
So the predictive index has been around for over 70 years, and it is a word-based selection process. And I'm just wondering, I thought I was loud. I'm just wondering, with the predictive index, have you ever taken a look to see if the words are updated, if they're fair? I mean, since it is word-based and we're talking about gendered words.
Yeah, I don't know, actually. That's a really great point. I'll look it up for sure. Yeah, the research that I've read into it didn't specifically mention that, but that's a really great resource. I hope so,
I mean,
actually.
I like it, but just in view of what you've said, I'm starting to question it.
Sure, I'll take a look.
Do I have time for one more?
Go for it.
So I'm wondering about this ideal of sponsorship.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm thinking about how limited the selection is, and how do we keep the bias out of the selection, really, without regimenting it?
So you mean the bias among sponsors?
Absolutely.
Yes, so awareness, obviously, but interestingly, especially in environments where they can be incentivized and where there can be accountability. You heard me mention that yesterday when you talk about money, you talk about power and leaders, it's accountability. So the most effective way, honestly, is for senior level leaders, who are the ones that we're mostly talking about here, to one, make them aware of what these biases and issues are. And notably, I will say this is a conversation we've been having for a very long time. And still, as we know, a lot of men still don't know that this is an issue. But at that point then, to hold them accountable. So for example, organizations can put goals or targets, I won't necessarily say quotas, but organization-specific goals in place for senior level leaders, and they need, in their succession plan coming up behind them, they need 40% women in that pool. How are you going to get that? The only way you're going to get that is by sponsoring and providing development opportunities. So you don't necessarily tell them that they have to sponsor X number of women, and again, a lot of companies places like Catalyst, when we work with them, well, how are we going to achieve that? How are we going to meet those goals? That you're going to sponsor that kind of talent. Because the other piece of this too is that, unlike with mentoring, where the kind of advice and guidance that you're going to get, fascinatingly enough, is that a mentor is more likely to give a man advice about getting business acumen, for example, whereas he'll say to the woman, you need to improve your communication style, right? And that's not helpful, but that's a mentoring issue. But with sponsorship, we're truly talking about, okay, we've got Joanne here, and I want her to be a part of the pool of succession talent in my organization. So if she's maybe 3 to 5 years out of coming up into this level, what skills, 2, 3, 4 things, experiences does she need to have between now and then to be prepared? Because the problem is that it's those opportunities, the doors that sponsors open, that overwhelmingly they're opening those doors for men but not for women. So women languish in roles. They spend much longer in individual roles than men do. They get promoted at much lower rates. Their compensation growth is much slower than men's. So it's truly just that intentional piece of saying, this is not a talent problem. There's nothing wrong with the women. We all know that. But it's ensuring that you're opening the door so that women can grow at the same rate as men do. That's all it is. And so we have seen companies have a lot of success with that accountability piece to help with that bias. Because you're not going to stop them from being biased. You're just not. But you got to change their behavior.
Anna, just another spectacular talk. I heard you 3 years ago, and I would have come today just for this. Your data collection is superb, and you're making a big difference. One of the questions I want to ask, though, is a talk I give in terms of helping women stay and move up. It's called It Takes a Village to Advance Women and Men in STEM. And one of the points I make is, especially at the time when you were juggling work and home, because you've got small people to deal with, to get involved with teams. And the argument is that teams really are more effective. They do the most impactful work. As you pointed out in terms of patenting, when you have women, you see them showing up in the teams. How do women get the credit to follow through on this, to make it a worthwhile?
Yes, that is a great question. So I run an entire workshop called Take Charge of Your Career, which it's not about fixing the women, it's about giving women the exact skills they need. So for example, one big piece of it stems from this research that we did called Myth of the Ideal Worker, where we, with our 10,000 high potentials, measured all the specific strategies that women and men were using to advance their careers. And we tested, of all of these things that people do, and there are a lot, what actually predicts advancement. Turns out for women, there are literally only two things. Two. One is sponsorship. The other is getting visibility for your accomplishments. Literally. Now for men, they're different. Sponsorship is the same, but the second is around, sadly, blurring of work-life boundaries. That plays into men being the breadwinner. We don't recommend that, but it works. So that's problematic. And also, the third is scanning for opportunities outside. So job hopping, turns out, is really beneficial for men. It hurts women's careers. Job hopping hurts women's careers because women are evaluated on proven performance and men on potential. So job hopping really hurts women's careers. So to the point about getting visibility for your accomplishments, we know this is very hard for women because we are socialized to be modest. We are socialized, like in school, we put our head down, we do a really great job, we excel. That stops us the day you graduate. Once you get into the workforce, if you're not getting credit for what you do, you will never succeed to the extent to which your capabilities will really allow. So there are a lot of things that women can do to walk what is an admittedly fine tightrope in order to do that. And there are a couple of that research shows to be effective. So one is a very simple thing, and that's where you get an email that thanks you for the work you've done on anything, or someone else's words acknowledge your contributions to something. It's not you saying that, it's someone else saying that in writing, usually is the easiest. Forward that sucker along to anybody you think could potentially help you down the line. Seriously. You forward it and you say, I'm just passing along some great feedback that I did on paper Y, project X, pick your word. And you do that on a regular basis. You do not wait for your 10-year review. You do not wait for your performance evaluation once a year. You do that once a month, a couple times a week. Whenever it is that you get those kinds of emails, you forward that along because you are using someone else's words. There is no risk involved in that. So that's a tiny little thing. Bigger things, honestly, it's going to sound silly, but there's a really interesting strategy called brag bites. I hate the term bragging because it plays, have you heard about this? It plays into horrible stereotypes around bragging and women aren't supposed to brag, but the concept is a great one. Okay, it's about learning how to talk about your accomplishments in a way that is still gender appropriate, and yet you still are talking about how awesome you are. Truly. So bear with me for a second. I promise I'll finish. I realize I'm over time. So essentially, I realize this is a bit of a corporate example, but there are plenty of academic examples of this too. Everybody has water coolers where you're going to lunch. So you're walking down the hall, you're headed to the bathroom, you're going to get a cup of coffee, you're going to lunch. Pick anything that's in a casual type of environment. In the back of your head, you're going to have 1 or 2 sentences about something recent and cool you've done. Doesn't matter what it is, something. And that you become to get into the habit of having a sentence or 2. This is not an elevator pitch that's 30 seconds. This is 10 seconds. It is a sentence or 2 that summarizes something cool you've done recently. Here's how it goes. You're in the hallway, very American thing I realize, but they say, oh, hi, how are you doing? Everybody's I'm great, fine, how are you, right? Instead, oh, hi, yeah, how are you doing? You know, they're not even paying attention. They maybe not even see your face or who you are. Thank you for asking. I've actually had an incredible experience. I just got back from Vienna, where I worked with the EU to completely revamp their recruitment processes. How are you? I kid you not, I've literally used that, because I did do that, and I promise you, it does not matter who that person is, they're going to be like, hello, okay, who is this? That's interesting. And before you know it, all of a sudden, you're on people's radar screens in a way that is subtle, stereotypically feminine. It's fine. You're pleasant. You're casual. You're chatting. But you get people's reactions. You get people's attention. And if you can get into the habit of getting comfortable talking about how awesome you are, the cool thing you did recently, it doesn't have to be a massive thing. It can be a relatively small thing. But if you can get into the habit, I realize it's not a gender-neutral thing or gender-conforming thing, but you have to do it. Because if you're talking up, Dad, take a second. If you're talking up what you've done, someone else tries to take credit for that, good luck with that. Because you've already told them what you've been doing on that. So there's real potential in that. We've got other strategies, but those are some fun ones.